My name is Rashmi Halker Singh, and I'm the online and social media editor for Headache. I'm joined here today with Dr. Yousef Yengej, who is one of the authors of a recent publication entitled Different Characteristics of Cortical Spreading Depression in the Sleep and Wake States. Welcome, and I'm so excited to have a conversation with you about this recent publication.
Thank you so much.
First of all, can you walk us through this really interesting study?
Yeah, so let me give you a little bit of a technical background. I promise I won't make it too technical. But basically what we did is we designed a fitness tracker for mice. And we mounted this on the head of the mouse so we could measure its movement, but also the blood flow in the brain at the location where it was mounted. And in my lab, we're very interested in headaches and CSD. So we started with a mouse model in which we could trigger CSD using optogenetics. And one of the first things we did was actually to see how these mice would respond and how the blood flow would be in the brain during a CSD. And the wonderful thing about our technique is that we can do this in freely moving animals. So we can record them for up to a month or even several months, which allows us to really kind of follow or track them in their natural behavior and also trigger CSD during different stages of the sleep and wake cycle. And yeah, so what we did for this experiment and this paper is that we had a couple of mice. And we were very interested to see what the difference was in their CSD and the progression of their CSD when they were awake and when they were asleep, because there's a lot of clinical evidence that patients tend to wake up with a migraine and that the progression can be different during higher activity or lower activity. So we were very interested to see if we could replicate that in our mouse model and if we could see any differences there.
So that's really fascinating. You know, CSD is an interesting component of migraine. We don't really understand it very well. And I think better understanding it through a mouse model will really add to our understanding of migraine in general. So what did you find?
So one of the first findings we found, which was very exciting, is to trigger the CSD, because we use an optogenetic model, we need to basically give a stimulation for a certain duration. And the stimulation is blue light. And we just measured how long we needed to turn this blue light on to actually trigger a CSD in these mice. And one of the first very interesting things we found was that when they were asleep, the stimulation was a lot shorter until we triggered a CSD than when they were awake. And this is very interesting, of course, because it somehow shows that the threshold or something like that when they are sleeping is lower to trigger a CSD event. And a very interesting thing is, of course, we could measure how long they were asleep or awake before we triggered them. And we saw that if they were asleep longer, the threshold was shorter. And when they were awake longer, that the threshold was higher. So it was not just a difference, but there was also a correlation between the amount they were asleep or the duration they were asleep before we triggered CSD. And then next we started investigating and looking at the shapes of the CSD and the progression because we were very excited to see if it was the same during sleep and awake. And we first compared it to the CSD triggered under anesthesia, which is a very common model. We don't show too much of it in our paper because it has been published many, many times. But we show it as an example on top of the averages we see when they were asleep or awake. And one of the very characteristic things was that in freely moving animals, the CSD is a lot shorter. So that for us was an indication that our model really added something new compared to the previous anesthesia models. And then if we look at the shapes, we see that there is differences in the progression of the CSD. And also the timing of certain changes in the blood flow. We broke this up in a couple of stages, and I can explain it here, but I think it's better if you look at the figures. But what you see is that there are very characteristic differences at the start and the end of the CSD if the animals are awake or asleep. And also the duration of the CSD was a lot shorter if the animals were awake. So that got us very excited because we already saw that the stimulation threshold was dependent on how long they were asleep or awake. So then we also started to investigate if these differences we saw between awake or asleep were dependent on the duration of wakefulness or how long they were sleeping. And indeed, we compared 4 different stages during the CSD, and we saw that during the stages where we saw a difference between awake and asleep, that difference was also always dependent or inversely dependent on how long they were awake or asleep. And sometimes this was a very strong effect, and sometimes this was a weaker effect. But it was very interesting to see that the shape and the progression of a CSD is very much influenced and affected by if the animal are sleeping or awake, and also the duration of sleep or awake, which can indicate some kind of sleep pressure or awake pressure mechanism driving this. And then actually, so I told you already that we used kind of like a fitness tracker, so we could measure more than just blood flow. So one of the things we also started measuring was movement, and especially in our case, head movement, because that's where we mounted the sensor. And what we saw during the CSD, well, obviously you get tons of data. So, and we had to start somewhere. So we started looking for certain patterns we always saw happening during a specific stage of the CSD. And we hoped by looking at this that we could somehow get a better idea of the behavior of the mouse. Because one of the limitations of mouse models is that you can obviously not ask it if it has a migraine or pain. So the only thing we can have is the readouts we get. And a very interesting thing we found is that if the animals were awake during the start of the CSD, during the biggest change in the biggest vasoconstriction, basically, we always saw a reduction in movement. And we compared this to video we have of the mice, and we see kind of like a freezing behavior. And when the animals were asleep, almost during the same phase, so again with the biggest vasoconstriction, we saw that they always woke up for a brief moment. And of course, we again still cannot ask the mice what they were feeling, but at least this indicates that something was happening there, which triggered more in the mouse than just a physiological response, but also a change in its state. And this was very interesting because we saw again in the sleeping mice that they went back to sleep, and the wake mouse just, during the prolonged phase of the CSD just went back to whatever a mouse does, sniffing, grooming, eating. But it indicated to us that there was a very characteristic phase during the CSD where the mouse actually felt something or was triggered by something we did. And then last but not least, we were interested to see, because with the blood flow, we could also extract, of course, the heart rate from the data we have, which is basically by doing a frequency analysis on the signal. And what we saw was that during the CSD, also the heart rate changes in different ways of the mouse. And as expected, when the mice were sleeping, the heart rate was low. When the mice were awake, the heart rate was high. But then during the phase of the biggest change in vasoconstriction at the start of the CSD, we always saw that the heart rate kind of went to a medium kind of state around 8 to 10 hertz, which is about 60 BPM. And no matter if they were awake or asleep. So it kind of went to the same level. And then, during the prolonged phase of the CSD, they went back to their either sleep or awake stages. And then at the end, they again went to like a kind of level in the middle at the end of the CSD, where you get again a big vasodilation back to normal blood flow levels. And we first thought like, okay, sure, this is probably because they move less or more, what I discussed before, the freezing or the waking up. So we correlated the movement to the heart rate, right? And if you get a good correlation, that would mean that all the heart rate could be explained basically by movement. So we saw during baseline that it was the case. We found a very strong correlation between heart rate and movement. But then during the start of the CSD, we saw that the correlation went to minus 0.013. So that's a very weak inverse correlation. And then during the prolonged phase of the CSD, we got again a strong correlation. And then at the end of the CSD, we got a stronger inversed correlation. So to us, this indicated that during the start and the end of the CSD, we could not explain the heart rate just by movement, and something else must have been going on. And what it is, of course, we did not further investigate. I think it's very interesting, but it could indicate some kind of stress response or some kind of other response or some kind of reflex regulating the blood flow, which has a direct effect on heart rate. So that's basically our experiment here. Yeah, and we were very excited about it and very thankful and happy that we could share this.
That's such an elegant study, and adds so much to our understanding of migraine with this animal model, especially given the relationship with sleep, which from a human standpoint is a common time for people to experience migraine. So it's so interesting when we think about people that, people every day. I just actually saw a patient today who just told me she's having a severe migraine attack and wanted to go to sleep, yet we commonly see people have migraine attacks coming out of sleep as well. And I think this animal model of migraine will hopefully add to our understanding of that as well. Thank you so much for going through that um, in such detail. I think it's really, really exciting work. Are you working on any of these next steps in your lab at the moment?
So yeah, I'm working on a couple of things. First of all, the technique. This was basically the first thing we did with it, and we feel this is the top of the iceberg. We're also applying it to new migraine paradigms. We want to test different compounds and how they affect the CSD, because we feel this is a very nice way of testing the effect on the CSD. But also we are employing it in like sleep studies, in hypoxia studies and other things. We're just trying out to figure out more about the blood flow in the brain and how it's affected under different circumstances. And then second of all, we're also focusing on including more readout parameters in these sensors. I cannot go into too much detail yet because it's all very experimental and I don't want to overpromise things which might not work. But I feel like there's a couple of very exciting new routes we're testing. And yeah, hopefully later this year we can have some data and show some more that it's working, and actually get a better understanding of what you said, like try to explain this patient's experiences with a mouse model and basically be able to investigate the mechanisms, yeah, in a really new way, I feel.
Well, all of that is so exciting, and we look forward to more data coming from your lab. Thank you so much for spending time with me today.
Thank you so much.